Officer Daniel Stone was no ordinary cop. He moved through the city with an air of absolute authority. Every shift, every patrol, reinforced the sense that he was untouchable. His patrol car glided effortlessly through the streets of the bustling metropolis, a place that now seemed smaller with every turn of his steering wheel. In his mind, he was not just enforcing the law, he was above it. Years of wearing the badge had eroded his sense of accountability, and now it was merely a symbol of his power. Daniel had faced complaints before, sure, but they never stuck. He was good at covering his tracks, brushing aside minor infractions, and bending the rules just enough to stay out of serious trouble. He thrived on the unspoken rules of the streets, his streets. Every glance from a pedestrian, every nervous shuffle from a driver pulled over, only fueled his ego. Daniel wasn't worried about being called out on anything because he knew the game better than anyone. If anyone dared file a complaint, he had enough connections within the department to make sure it was brushed aside without ever seeing the light of day. That day was no different. As he drove his usual route, the city moved around him like a well-rehearsed play, with Daniel positioned as the lead. People knew him, or at least, they knew what he represented. And for Daniel, that was enough. The siren on top of his car wasn't just a warning to lawbreakers, it was a declaration of his power. Few dared challenge him, and those who did usually regretted it. He liked the control, the respect, or rather the fear that his badge commanded. But today, something unexpected broke his rhythm. Suddenly, his focus snapped. A sleek, black luxury sedan raced past him. The purr of its engine was low, controlled. Everything about the car screamed opulence. Daniel's eyes narrowed. There was no crime in driving an expensive car, but something about the way it moved caught his attention. The vehicle seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong in this part of town. The neighborhood they were in wasn't exactly known for its high-end vehicles. Daniel knew these streets well, and this wasn't the kind of area where luxury sedans casually cruised by. It was the kind of place where people with too much money didn't linger, and that's when his eyes locked onto the driver, a black woman, dressed with the kind of elegance that matched the car she drove. Her presence triggered something deep within Daniel. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. In Daniel's mind, something didn't add up. The disparity between her and the setting she was in gnawed at him, feeding into the prejudices he had long carried with him. He'd never admit it, but it wasn't just the speeding car that set him off. There was something else, a deep, ingrained bias that now surfaced. She didn't look like she belonged here. Not in a car like that. Not in this neighborhood. A wave of suspicion washed over him. Prejudices he wouldn't admit, even to himself, rose to the surface. He'd dealt with situations like this before. He had assumptions, and they usually paid off. He wasn't worried about making a mistake because, in his mind, he never did. With a flick of his wrist, Daniel activated his lights, maneuvering his patrol car to catch up with the sedan. The familiar rush of adrenaline coursed through him. This was his moment to assert his authority. His pulse quickened, but not from fear. It was from excitement, from the feeling of control that flooded him every time he made a stop. As the woman's car came to a halt, Daniel's heart rate quickened, not from fear, but from the anticipation of another opportunity to assert control. He parked just behind her, stepping out with a swagger that was all too familiar. His hand rested casually on the holster of his gun as he approached the driver's window. He noticed the shine of the luxury vehicle as he walked alongside it. The car's glossy surface reflected the bright afternoon sun, nearly blinding him for a moment. The pristine condition of the car irritated him. How could someone afford something like this in a neighborhood like this? The answer seemed obvious to Daniel. Something wasn't right. "License and registration," he barked, his voice oozing with authority, though laced with an undertone of disdain. The woman didn't flinch. Her calm composure immediately threw him off. There was no nervous scrambling for her documents, no fear in her eyes. She moved with a deliberateness that was foreign to Daniel. It was unsettling. Most drivers he stopped would be fumbling by now, their hands shaking as they reached for their papers. Not her. Without a word, she handed over the requested paperwork. Her demeanor was unnerving, quiet confidence, almost too sure of herself. Daniel didn't like it. He didn't like how poised she was, how unfazed she seemed. There was something wrong here, something that challenged the dynamic he was used to. He leaned in closer, scrutinizing her license. His eyes moved over the details, searching for something, anything that would validate his suspicion, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Her license was valid. The car was registered under her name, and yet something about the situation gnawed at him. He glanced at her again. She sat there, composed, unbothered, as if she had all the time in the world. Daniel's mind raced. She was too calm. That wasn't normal. Why wasn't she reacting? Where was the nervousness he was used to seeing in drivers? Where was the apology, the stammering explanation? The quiet defiance in her silence only fueled his growing frustration. "Nice car," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Are you sure it's yours?" His words were a thinly veiled accusation, one he expected to rattle her. The woman didn't waver. Her gaze met his without hesitation. "Yes," she said simply. "I bought it with my own money." Daniel smirked, not bothering to hide the condescension in his voice. The audacity of her calm response irked him even more. "Interesting. Not exactly the kind of vehicle we usually see around here. Do you live in the area, or just passing through?" "I live here," she replied evenly. "My house is just down the street." Daniel's jaw clenched. She wasn't reacting the way he expected. Most drivers he pulled over would have shown signs of nervousness by now, maybe even stumbled over their words. But she was unbothered, almost as if she had nothing to prove. Her calmness only served to stoke the fire of his growing frustration. His eyes flicked back to her paperwork, searching for any excuse to prolong the stop. He scanned her registration, looking for discrepancies, something to latch onto, but found none. He wasn't ready to let this go, not yet. "Mind telling me where you work? Maybe I should call your employer and verify that everything checks out." "I'm an attorney," she answered, her voice steady. "I work at Benson & Lyon." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Benson & Lyon was one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. He had heard of their reputation, but that only made his irritation grow. It wasn't just about power anymore. Now it felt personal. This woman was more than just a driver in a luxury car. She was someone who could easily challenge him if she wanted to. That realization only deepened his resolve to maintain control. "An attorney, huh?" he muttered, trying to mask the unease creeping into his voice. "Must be nice defending criminals all day. I wonder how you'll feel when you're the one in trouble." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't bite. "I'm not breaking any laws, officer," she said, her tone unwavering. "If you'd like to check my record, feel free." For a moment, Daniel considered pushing further, escalating the situation just to see if he could break that calm facade. But there was a lingering sense of discomfort he couldn't shake. Something about this woman felt different, like there was more to her than he realized. He was on edge, but he didn't know why. "I'll let you off with a warning this time," Daniel finally said, the words leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He handed back her documents, reluctant to end the encounter but unsure of how to continue without drawing more attention than he wanted. The woman took her documents, her movements as deliberate and poised as they had been at the start. "Thank you, officer," she said, her voice steady. "Have a nice day." Without another word, she rolled up the window and drove away, leaving Daniel standing there, watching the car disappear into the distance. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of doubt. Back in his patrol car, Daniel's thoughts churned. Who was she? He shook off the feeling and continued his patrol, but the encounter lingered in his mind. Something about her calmness, her confidence. It unnerved him. And what Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have guessed, was that the woman he had just tried to intimidate was not just any attorney. She was Sarah Lee, the wife of his new police captain, Marcus Lee. And this encounter was about to change his life in ways he never saw coming. The city lights flickered in the distance as Sarah Lee pulled into her driveway, the hum of the luxury sedan's engine fading as she parked. She sat for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The encounter with Officer Daniel Stone replayed in her mind, his arrogance, the thinly veiled prejudice that laced every word he spoke. It wasn't the first time she had been treated that way, but it stung a little more, knowing exactly who her husband was. Sarah exhaled, letting the frustration slip away. She knew better than to escalate the situation earlier. Revealing her identity as Captain Marcus Lee's wife could have ended the interaction swiftly, but she hadn't done that. No, she preferred to see how far Stone would go. She wanted to witness his arrogance in full display, to see if he would dig his own grave, and he had. She grabbed her bag from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car, her heels clicking on the stone driveway as she walked toward the front door of their stately home. Inside, her husband Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. He had always been like that, silent but observing everything, missing nothing. As soon as she walked in, he gave her a knowing glance. "How was your day?" Sarah smiled, setting her bag on the counter. "Eventful," she replied, her tone light. But there was an edge to it, one that Marcus didn't miss. She leaned against the counter, her eyes meeting his. "I had a run-in with one of your officers today." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze narrowing slightly. "Which one?" "Daniel Stone," she said, her voice casual, though she was fully aware of the weight of her words. For a moment, Marcus didn't react, his expression unchanged, but Sarah knew her husband well enough to catch the subtle shift in his posture, the way his fingers drummed lightly against the table as he processed the information. He knew who Daniel Stone was. Every captain knows their problem officers. "And what did Stone do?" Marcus finally asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Sarah recounted the encounter with cool precision, detailing the thinly veiled insults, the insinuations, and the way Daniel had tried to provoke her. She could see the tension building in Marcus as she spoke, his jaw tightening ever so slightly, but he remained composed as always. When she finished, Marcus sat in silence for a few moments, his eyes fixed on the table. Finally, he stood up, walking over to the window and looking out into the night. "I knew Stone had issues," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I didn't realize it was this bad." "He's used to getting away with it," Sarah said, her voice firm. "He thinks he's untouchable." Marcus turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Not anymore." Meanwhile, Daniel Stone was patrolling the city as if nothing had happened. The interaction with the woman earlier that day had left a strange, lingering discomfort in the back of his mind, but he brushed it off. He had done nothing wrong, at least not in his eyes. The stop was justified, and if she hadn't liked his tone, well, that wasn't his problem. He had a job to do, and she wasn't exempt from the law just because she drove an expensive car. Still, something about the encounter had unsettled him, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Her calmness had thrown him off. Most people reacted to his authority with fear or at least a degree of nervousness, but she had been almost defiant, though not in an obvious way. It was as if she knew something he didn't. That bothered him. As he drove through the city, the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the streets. He was heading toward a quieter neighborhood, one where he could finish his patrol in peace. It had been a long day, and he was ready to get home. But just as he was about to turn a corner, his radio crackled to life. "Stone, report to the station immediately." The dispatcher's voice came through, flat and formal. There was no urgency in the tone, but the words sent a ripple of anxiety through Daniel. Why was he being called back now? His thoughts raced as he turned the car around, heading back to the station. He hadn't done anything out of the ordinary today, had he? The traffic stop earlier flashed in his mind again, but there was nothing there. Nothing to worry about. At least that's what he told himself. When Daniel arrived at the station, the usual chatter and activity seemed muted. It was late, and only a few officers were still around, finishing up their reports or preparing to head home. Daniel walked down the hallway toward his desk, but before he could sit down, a voice called out behind him. "Stone, Captain Lee wants to see you." Daniel froze for a moment, his mind racing. Captain Marcus Lee. He had only been in charge for a short time, but his reputation had already spread through the department like wildfire. Lee was known for being tough but fair. He didn't tolerate any nonsense, and he had a keen eye for corruption. Some officers respected him, others feared him. Daniel wasn't sure where he stood yet. He made his way to Lee's office, trying to keep his expression neutral. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Lee was seated behind his desk, his hands clasped in front of him, his face unreadable. As Daniel stepped inside, Lee gestured for him to close the door. "Sit down," Lee said, his voice calm but firm. Daniel sat, the anxiety now creeping into his chest. He couldn't read Lee's expression, but there was something about his posture, the way he held himself, that made Daniel's stomach twist. "I'm sure you know why you're here," Lee began, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. Daniel shifted in his seat, trying to maintain his composure. "I'm not sure, sir," he replied, his voice steady, though inside his mind was racing. Lee leaned back in his chair, his gaze cold and calculating. "You made a traffic stop earlier today? A woman driving a black luxury sedan. Does that ring a bell?" Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Of course it rang a bell. But why was Lee bringing it up? He had done everything by the book, hadn't he? "Yes, sir," Daniel replied. "The driver was speeding, so I pulled her over. Standard procedure." Lee's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he opened a file on his desk, flipping through the pages slowly. "Tell me, Stone," Lee said after a moment, "what exactly did you say to this woman during the stop?" Daniel felt the tension building in his chest, but he kept his tone calm. "I asked for her license and registration, and I informed her why she was being stopped. Everything was routine, sir." Lee's gaze hardened. "Routine, you say?" There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Daniel shifted in his seat again, suddenly feeling very small under Lee's intense scrutiny. "Let me be clear," Lee said, his voice low but firm. "That woman you stopped today, she's my wife." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He felt the blood drain from his face, his mind reeling as he processed the words. Captain Lee's wife? He had stopped the captain's wife? "She didn't tell me who she was," Daniel blurted out, desperate to find a way out of the growing sense of dread that was clawing at him. "I didn't know, sir. Lee raised a hand, cutting him off. "I don't care if she told you or not. What I care about is how you conducted yourself during that stop." Daniel swallowed hard, his mind racing for something to say. But no words came. He could feel his career slipping through his fingers, the power he had always clung to evaporating in an instant. "I've reviewed your record, Stone," Lee continued, his tone cold. "You've had complaints before. Harassment, misconduct, excessive force. It seems you've gotten very comfortable with that badge, thinking it puts you above the rules." Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but Lee cut him off again. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to be under my direct supervision from now on. Every stop, every report, every action you take will be watched closely. I will not tolerate any more abuses of power in this department. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Lee leaned forward, his eyes locked onto Daniel's. "You've used up all your chances, Stone. This is your last one. Don't waste it." The weight of Lee's words settled over Daniel like a crushing force. He left the office, his mind spinning, his heart pounding. He had just received a lifeline, but it came with a noose attached. One more slip, and he would hang himself with it. As he walked back to his desk, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that his world was beginning to unravel, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The station felt different after Daniel's meeting with Captain Lee. The usual rhythm of his daily routine seemed off, like a clock that had been wound too tightly, ticking faster than it should. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that every eye was on him, even though no one appeared to be watching. His colleagues went about their tasks, seemingly indifferent to his presence, but Daniel knew better. News traveled fast in the department, especially when it involved the captain. Each step Daniel took down the hallway felt heavier than the last, his thoughts racing as he processed the conversation in Lee's office. Captain Marcus Lee had just put him on notice, and not just any notice. This was a clear signal that his career was hanging by a thread. The unspoken rules that had always shielded Daniel, the ones he had leaned on for protection, seemed to be crumbling beneath him. He had been a fixture at the station for years, untouchable in his mind, but now the ground felt unstable. As he sat at his desk, Daniel stared blankly at the reports in front of him. The words blurred together as his mind drifted back to the traffic stop. It had been routine, hadn't it? He had followed protocol, or so he had convinced himself. But the memory of the woman's calm, composed demeanor lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. She hadn't been shaken. She hadn't been intimidated by him the way most people were. And that had made him push harder, dig deeper, hoping to provoke a reaction. He rubbed his temples, trying to dispel the headache building behind his eyes. He had no idea that the woman he had tried to intimidate was Captain Lee's wife, but that didn't matter now. Lee had made it clear. Daniel's past behavior had finally caught up to him. There was no escaping it this time. His complaints had been ignored before, brushed under the rug by the old leadership, but not anymore. Lee wasn't like the others. He had a reputation for being fair but unyielding, a man who didn't tolerate the abuse of power within his department. The silence in the station felt oppressive, pressing in on Daniel as he tried to focus on the paperwork before him. He couldn't afford another mistake, not with Lee watching his every move. And yet, there was a part of him that bristled at the idea of being controlled, of being put in check by someone else. He had always operated with a sense of autonomy, bending the rules when it suited him, confident that no one would call him out. Now that confidence was slipping away, replaced by a gnawing sense of vulnerability. The rest of the day passed in a blur of monotony. Daniel went through the motions, filling out reports, responding to calls, but all the while, the weight of his situation pressed down on him. By the time his shift ended, the tension in his shoulders had reached a breaking point. He needed to clear his head, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the station. That evening, Daniel drove home in silence, his mind still reeling from the day's events. His home, once a place of refuge, now felt like just another source of stress. His marriage to Sarah had been strained for years, the distance between them growing wider with each passing day. They had long since stopped trying to fix it, content to live in a state of quiet detachment. Daniel had sought comfort elsewhere, in the arms of Claire, a fellow officer's wife. The affair had started as a distraction, a way to escape the mounting pressure in his life. But now, even that felt like another burden. When he walked through the door that night, Sarah barely looked up from the book she was reading in the living room. The silence between them was comfortable, familiar, but this time, it felt different. Daniel's mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversation with Lee over and over, his thoughts spiraling into a vortex of guilt and fear. He didn't want to talk about it, and Sarah didn't ask. That was the nature of their relationship now. Avoidance, silence, and an unspoken understanding that neither of them was willing to confront the growing chasm between them. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty plate in front of him, his appetite gone. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a brief reprieve from the oppressive quiet of the house. It was Claire. She wanted to meet him, as usual, at a discreet hotel on the outskirts of the city. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. The thrill of their meetings had long since faded, replaced by the constant fear of being discovered. But the idea of getting away, even for a short while, was tempting. He convinced himself that he could manage it, that he could be careful enough to avoid suspicion. After all, he had been balancing this double life for months now, and no one had found out. But deep down, Daniel knew the risks were growing with every encounter. He texted her back, agreeing to meet, and left the house without a word to Sarah. The drive to the hotel was tense, the weight of the day's events still pressing down on him. When he arrived, Claire was already waiting in the room, her expression a mix of longing and worry. "You took your time," she said as he closed the door behind him, her voice tinged with frustration. "I thought you weren't going to come." Daniel forced a smile, though it felt hollow. "It's been a long day," he replied, sitting down beside her. His mind was still racing, his thoughts clouded by the conversation with Lee. Claire rested her head on his shoulder, her touch familiar but no longer comforting. "I've missed you," she murmured, though Daniel could hear the uncertainty in her voice. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't press him for details. They had always kept their relationship on the surface, never delving too deeply into their personal lives. Daniel wrapped an arm around her, but his mind was elsewhere. The encounter with Lee had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. The precariousness of his situation was becoming clearer with every passing moment. and the affair with Claire, which had once been an escape, now felt like another trap. "What's wrong?" Claire asked, sensing his distance. Daniel sighed, leaning back against the headboard. "It's just work," he said, though the words felt inadequate. "Things are complicated." Claire sat up, her brow furrowed. "Complicated how?" Daniel hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her. She wasn't just his lover. She was the wife of a fellow officer, someone who had the potential to blow his life apart if she ever decided to. But he needed to talk to someone, and Claire was the only person who knew enough about his world to understand. "I'm under a lot of pressure," he admitted, his voice low. "The new captain, he's got his eye on me. Things could get bad if I slip up." Claire frowned, concern etched across her face. "What do you mean? What's he watching you for?" Daniel rubbed his face, the weight of his words heavy on his shoulders. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And now, I've got to be perfect. If I screw up again, it's over." Claire was silent for a moment, her eyes searching his face for answers. "And what about us?" she asked softly. "Are you worried about, getting caught?" Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. The thought of someone finding out about their affair had always been in the back of his mind, but now, with Lee watching his every move, the risk felt even greater. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice strained. "I can't afford any more mistakes." Claire nodded, her expression somber. "Maybe we should take a break, at least until things settle down?" Daniel felt a pang of guilt, but he knew she was right. The affair had become too dangerous, too risky. But the thought of letting it go, of losing the only escape he had left, was unbearable. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice hollow. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their situation hanging heavy in the air. When Daniel finally left the hotel that night, the knot in his chest had only tightened. His life was spiraling out of control, and he had no idea how to stop it. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the station to find an envelope on his desk. It was plain white, with no markings or return address. His heart skipped a beat as he picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly. He opened it slowly, his stomach twisting with a sense of dread. Inside was a single photograph, Daniel and Claire, clearly taken as they entered the hotel together. His world stopped. Someone knew. Someone had been watching. The photograph was proof that his secret was no longer safe. Daniel scanned the room, his eyes darting from one officer to the next, searching for any sign that someone might be behind this. But everyone appeared oblivious, going about their work as usual. No one even glanced in his direction. His mind raced, 1,000 possibilities flashing through his thoughts. Who had taken the photo? What were they planning to do with it? Was this a warning or something more sinister? Panic surged through Daniel as he shoved the photograph back into the envelope and stuffed it into his desk drawer. His hands shook as he sat down, his mind spiraling into a storm of fear and paranoia. Whoever was behind this, they held his life in their hands. And if they decided to reveal the truth, everything would come crashing down around him. The photograph haunted Daniel for days. It was all he could think about. Each time he sat at his desk, the image of him and Claire walking into the hotel played over and over in his mind. It didn't matter how well he tried to bury it. The sense of dread was always there, lingering just below the surface, threatening to overwhelm him. The envelope was still in his desk drawer, untouched since he shoved it there. He hadn't dared to take it out again. He started to notice things, little things. The way his colleagues glanced at him as he walked through the station, the way conversations would quiet down when he entered the room. He felt their eyes on him, their judgment. Were they talking about him? Did they know? Or was it just his imagination? Paranoia had started to creep in, twisting every glance, every word into something darker, something dangerous. Daniel's nerves were frayed. He hadn't slept properly in days, his mind unable to rest, constantly cycling through the same thoughts. Who had taken the photo? How much did they know? Were they waiting for the right moment to expose him? Or was this their warning, a silent threat to keep him on edge? Every time his phone buzzed, his heart skipped a beat. his hands shaking as he reached for it. Every email, every message felt like it could be the one that would bring his whole world crashing down. But no message came, no ultimatum, no threats, just silence. It was the silence that unnerved him most of all. It left him waiting, on edge, bracing for an impact that might never come. The pressure was unbearable. It wasn't just the photograph, it was everything. Captain Lee's watchful eyes, the mounting scrutiny from his colleagues, the constant fear of being caught. And then, there was Claire. Every time he saw her, the weight of their affair pressed down harder. He had thought it was a way to escape, to relieve the stress, but now it felt like another trap. At home, things were no better. The distance between him and Sarah had grown even wider, an unspoken tension filling the air. Sarah knew something was wrong. How could she not? But she didn't ask, and Daniel didn't offer any explanations. Their marriage, already hanging by a thread, now felt like it was unraveling entirely. One night after another long, exhausting shift, Daniel sat alone in the living room, the house eerily silent. Sarah had already gone to bed, and the clock on the wall ticked loudly in the background. His mind wandered back to the photograph. It was like a wound that wouldn't heal, an infection festering beneath the surface. He had to do something. He couldn't keep living like this, waiting for the inevitable explosion. He considered his options. He could confront Claire, but what would that accomplish? She didn't know about the photograph. Telling her would only drag her into this mess, and there was no guarantee it would help. He could try to find out who took it, but how? He had no leads, no clues, just a sinking feeling that someone was watching, waiting for him to slip up. The only other option was Captain Lee. But the thought of going to Lee, of admitting to anything, filled Daniel with dread. Lee already had him on a tight leash. Confessing to the affair would only tighten the noose. And yet the idea of coming clean, of getting ahead of whatever was coming, nagged at the back of his mind. Maybe if he told Lee the truth, he could control the fallout. Maybe he could salvage something from the wreckage. The next day at the station, Daniel was on edge, every interaction feeling like a test of his composure. The tension was suffocating. He couldn't focus on his work, the paperwork in front of him a blur of meaningless words. His mind kept drifting back to the photograph, to the growing sense of doom that clung to him like a shadow. Halfway through the day, he made a decision. He couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the paranoia, it was eating him alive. He needed to do something, anything, to regain control. With a deep breath, Daniel stood up from his desk and walked toward Captain Lee's office. His heart pounded in his chest as he knocked on the door. Lee's voice called for him to enter, calm and authoritative as always. Daniel stepped inside, his pulse quickening as the door clicked shut behind him. Lee looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "What is it, Stone?" Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. For a moment he hesitated, unsure of how to begin. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive. "I need to talk to you," Daniel finally said, his voice strained. "It's important." Lee raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Go on." Daniel's hands clenched at his sides as he searched for the right words. How could he explain this without digging himself even deeper into the hole? How could he possibly make this right? "There's something you need to know," Daniel began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something that could affect the department." Lee's gaze sharpened, his attention fully on Daniel now. "What are you talking about?" Daniel took a deep breath, his mind racing. Should he do it? Should he come clean right now, tell Lee everything and hope for mercy? Or should he keep his mouth shut, ride out the storm, and hope the photograph never sees the light of day? Before he could speak, the door to Lee's office swung open. Another officer stepped in, a folder in hand, interrupting the moment. Daniel froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The officer glanced between Daniel and Lee, clearly sensing the tension in the room. "Captain, I've got those files you asked for," the officer said, holding out the folder. Lee nodded, taking the folder from the officer's hands. "Thank you, Jenkins. I'll review these later." Jenkins lingered for a moment, clearly curious about what was going on between Daniel and the captain, but eventually he turned and left, closing the door behind him. The interruption broke the moment, the tension dissipating slightly, but Daniel's heart was still racing. Lee turned his attention back to Daniel, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You were saying?" Daniel hesitated again, his mind spinning. The opportunity was slipping away. The interruption had shaken his resolve, and now the weight of what he was about to confess felt even heavier. He wasn't ready to do it, not yet. Daniel faltered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's nothing. Never mind." Lee studied him for a long moment, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Daniel could feel the scrutiny, the way Lee was dissecting every word, every movement. It was like standing under a microscope, exposed and vulnerable. "Is that all, Stone?" Lee finally asked, his tone firm. Daniel nodded quickly, his pulse still racing. "Yes, sir. Sorry for the interruption." Lee didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture that made Daniel's skin crawl. "Get back to work, then." Daniel turned and left the office, his heart pounding in his chest. The decision to say nothing weighed heavily on him, but he couldn't bring himself to confess. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The fear of what would happen if the truth came out was too much to bear. As the days passed, the tension inside Daniel only grew worse. His paranoia intensified, every interaction with his colleagues feeling like a trap. He couldn't shake the feeling that everyone knew, that the photograph was common knowledge, even though no one had said anything. It was driving him mad, the constant fear of exposure, the pressure of maintaining his facade. Claire was texting him more frequently, sensing his growing distance, but each time her name flashed on his phone, it only reminded him of the danger he was in. He couldn't bring himself to end it, though. Despite everything, despite the risk, she was still his only escape, the only person who made him feel even remotely in control. But even that was slipping away. Every time they met, the guilt gnawed at him a little more, the weight of their secret growing heavier. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. Something had to give. He was walking a razor-thin line, and one misstep would send him plummeting. And yet he couldn't stop. He couldn't stop lying to Claire, lying to Sarah, lying to Lee, and most of all, lying to himself. The walls were closing in, and Daniel was running out of places to hide. The tension at home had become unbearable. Sarah, once quiet and distant, had started to ask questions, her suspicions growing as Daniel became more withdrawn. She had noticed the late nights, the excuses, the way he would avoid her gaze when they spoke. She wasn't stupid. She knew something was wrong. One evening, as Daniel sat at the kitchen table staring blankly at his phone, Sarah walked in, her arms crossed over her chest. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm. Daniel's heart sank. He had been dreading this moment, but he knew it was inevitable. Sarah sat down across from him, her eyes searching his face. "What's going on, Daniel? You've been acting strange for weeks. Something's not right." Daniel swallowed hard, his mind racing for an excuse, a way out, but there was none. The truth was pressing against him, threatening to burst free. "I'm just under a lot of pressure at work," he said, his voice strained. "The new captain, he's got me on edge." Sarah's eyes narrowed, clearly unconvinced. "It's more than that. I can feel it." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his pulse quickening. "I don't know what you're talking about." Sarah's expression hardened. "Don't lie to me, Daniel. I know something's going on. You're hiding something." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. The walls were closing in, the pressure building to a breaking point. He couldn't keep this up much longer, but he wasn't ready to tell her the truth, not about Claire, not about the photograph, not about any of it. "Just drop it, Sarah," he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. Sarah's eyes flashed with hurt, but she didn't back down. "Fine," she said quietly, standing up from the table. "But this isn't over." As she walked away, Daniel felt the weight of his lies crushing down on him. He was trapped, caught in a web of his own making, and there was no way out. The days blurred into a haze of anxiety and dread for Daniel. Every morning he woke up with the same knot in his stomach, the same crushing weight on his chest. The photograph was a ticking time bomb, and he was powerless to stop it. Worse still, Captain Lee's words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of how close he was to losing everything. His career, his reputation, his marriage, it was all hanging by a thread. The fear that someone would expose him grew with each passing day. He couldn't shake the feeling that his every move was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Something had shifted. He could feel it in the way his colleagues interacted with him, the way they seemed to look at him just a second too long, their voices lowering into hushed whispers when he entered the room. Maybe it was his imagination, or maybe it wasn't. One morning, as Daniel was preparing to leave for his shift, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. His pulse quickened as he opened it, his eyes scanning the brief text. "Meet me at the docks. Midnight. Come alone." The message sent a cold shiver down his spine. The docks? Why the docks? And who was this? His mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be whoever had taken the photograph? Was this the moment everything would unravel? His first instinct was to ignore it, to delete the message and pretend it never happened. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he didn't have a choice. If he ignored the message, he would be left waiting in dread, always wondering when the axe would fall. But if he went, at least he'd have a chance to confront whoever was behind this. That night, as the city's lights dimmed and the shadows grew long, Daniel found himself driving toward the docks. His hands were clammy on the steering wheel, his mind racing with every possible outcome of this meeting. Was this a trap, a setup, or worse? Was it already too late to stop what was coming? He parked the car near a line of shipping containers, the salty air thick with the smell of the harbor. The docks were deserted, the quiet almost unnerving. As he stepped out of the car, his heart pounded in his chest, his nerves fraying with each passing second. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, a man in a dark jacket, his face obscured by the dim light. Daniel tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun, but he stopped himself. This wasn't the time for that. The man stepped forward, his movement slow and deliberate. Daniel's pulse quickened as the figure came into focus, and recognition dawned. "Carter?" Daniel breathed, his voice tinged with disbelief. Tom Carter, one of the department's narcotics agents. Daniel had crossed paths with him a few times, but they had never been close. What was he doing here? Carter nodded, his expression unreadable. "Stone, I didn't think you'd show." Daniel swallowed hard, his mind reeling. "What's this about? Why did you send that message?" Carter glanced around, ensuring they were alone before speaking again. "I know about the photograph." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He felt the blood drain from his face, his body going cold. How do you know?" "I have my ways," Carter said, his voice calm but firm. "Let's just say I've been keeping an eye on you for a while." Daniel's heart raced. "Why? What do you want?" Carter stepped closer, his gaze hard and unyielding. "It's not about what I want, Stone. It's about what you need to do." Daniel's mind whirled, his pulse pounding in his ears. "What do you mean?" Carter leaned in, his voice low. "You're in deep, Stone. That photograph is just the beginning. Whoever took it isn't going to stop there. If you want to get out of this mess with your career intact, you're going to need help, and I'm the only one who can give it to you." Daniel's stomach churned. "Help? How?" "There's an operation," Carter said, his tone measured. "Big players involved. High-level narcotics trafficking. We've been working undercover to bring them down for months, but we need someone inside. Someone who can get close, gain their trust." Daniel shook his head, the panic rising. "I'm not a narc. That's not my job." "It is now," Carter said, his voice cold. "You don't have a choice. Either you help us, or that photograph finds its way into the wrong hands. And once that happens, you're done." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Daniel's mind raced. Could this really be happening? Could Carter be serious? He had always been a beat cop, a guy who dealt with the day-to-day problems of the streets. Going undercover in a narcotics operation wasn't just out of his league, it was dangerous, life-threatening. And yet, what other choice did he have? "What's the job?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Carter's eyes flickered with something like approval. "There's a drug shipment coming into the city tomorrow night. It's being handled by a group we've been trying to take down for years. They're cautious, smart. We need you to infiltrate, get close to their leader, and find out where they're storing the drugs." Daniel's stomach twisted in knots. This was insane. He was a cop, yes, but not this kind of cop. He had never dealt with anything this high stakes before. The risk was enormous, but the alternative, losing everything, his career, his life as he knew it, was even worse. "Why me?" Daniel asked, still trying to wrap his head around the situation. "Because you've got nothing left to lose," Carter said bluntly. "You're a liability, Stone. Lee's got his eye on you. You've screwed up too many times, and this is your last chance to make things right. You either go undercover or you go down. It's that simple." Daniel's mind raced. Everything inside him screamed to say no, to walk away, but he couldn't. Carter was right. He had no other option. If the photograph got out, he was finished. His life would be over. But if he took this job, there was a chance, a slim one, but a chance that he could come out the other side with his career intact. He took a deep breath, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "Fine," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I'll do it." Carter's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "Good. We'll be in touch with the details." As Carter turned to leave, Daniel stood frozen, his mind still reeling from the conversation. He had just agreed to risk his life, to go undercover in a dangerous operation, all to protect a secret that had already cost him too much. And yet, as he watched Carter disappear into the shadows, a small part of him felt a strange sense of relief. At least now he had a plan. At least now he knew what was coming. But the relief was short-lived. As Daniel drove home that night, the weight of his decision settled over him like a heavy fog. The road ahead was dangerous, fraught with peril at every turn, and he had no idea if he'd make it out alive. The next day, Daniel's life continued as usual, but everything felt different. The station buzzed with the usual activity, but Daniel moved through it like a ghost, his thoughts consumed by what lay ahead. His colleagues greeted him, some with their usual indifference, others with more curiosity than before. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he pushed it aside. That night, as darkness fell, Daniel received the call. The details of the operation were simple but dangerous. He would meet Carter and another undercover agent at a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. From there, they would initiate contact with the drug traffickers, and Daniel would be introduced as a new recruit looking to get involved in the business. The hours leading up to the meeting were torturous. Every second dragged on, the tension in Daniel's chest building with each tick of the clock. He knew what was at stake, but that didn't make it any easier to face. He was about to step into a world of crime and danger, and if he made one wrong move, it would cost him his life. When the time came, Daniel left his house in silence. Sarah was asleep, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. As he drove to the warehouse, his mind raced with 1,000 possible outcomes, each one worse than the last. He had no idea what he was walking into, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its shadow stretching long across the empty lot. Carter was already there, waiting for him along with a man Daniel didn't recognize, a hardened figure with a cold, calculating gaze. "Let's do this," Carter said as Daniel approached. With a nod, Daniel followed them into the darkness, the weight of his decision heavier than ever. The night was heavy with tension as Daniel stepped into the dimly lit warehouse. Every sense was heightened, every sound amplified by the fear pulsing through his veins. He could feel the weight of Carter's gaze on him, measuring, judging. The hardened man next to Carter remained silent, his cold eyes flicking over Daniel like a predator sizing up its prey. They were here to meet the drug traffickers, a group Daniel had heard about in passing but never had any direct dealings with. This was a new level, a different world than the routine patrols and street arrests he was used to. The stakes had never been higher, and he had never felt more out of place. Inside the warehouse, the silence was oppressive. The space was dimly lit by a few hanging bulbs, casting long shadows over the rows of crates and equipment that lined the walls. It smelled of dust, rust, and something else. something chemical and dangerous. As they moved deeper into the building, Daniel's pulse quickened. He couldn't help but think about the risks. One wrong move, one slip-up, and it would be over. Not just his career, but his life. Carter had briefed him earlier on what to expect. They were here to make initial contact with a major supplier, a man named Vincent Morales. Morales was known for being ruthless, a man who operated by his own code. He trusted no one, and if he suspected any foul play, he wouldn't hesitate to deal with it in the most brutal way possible. Daniel took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. This was his chance to prove he was worth trusting, to get close to the operation, to find out where the drugs were coming from and where they were going. If he could pull this off, maybe he could salvage his career, maybe even his life. As they reached the back of the warehouse, a door creaked open, and a group of men stepped out from the shadows. At the center of the group stood Vincent Morales, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a sleek suit that seemed out of place in the grimy surroundings. His sharp eyes flicked over Daniel with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Carter stepped forward first, shaking hands with one of Morales' men. "This is the guy I told you about," Carter said, nodding toward Daniel. "Stone's reliable. He's looking to get into the business." Morales didn't say anything at first. His eyes were locked on Daniel, his expression unreadable. Daniel felt his stomach twist with nerves, but he kept his face neutral, doing his best to appear calm and confident. "You a cop?" Morales asked, his voice low and dangerous. The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Daniel's heart raced, but he knew this moment was crucial. One wrong word, one hint of hesitation, and everything would fall apart. "No," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "Not anymore." Morales studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he gave a small nod. "All right, let's see what you're made of." The tension in the room didn't ease as Morales signaled for one of his men to bring forward a crate. The lid was pried off, revealing stacks of neatly packaged bricks of cocaine. Daniel's eyes flicked over the drugs, his stomach churning with a mixture of fear and disgust. This was real. There was no turning back now. "We need someone to move this shipment," Morales said, his eyes still fixed on Daniel. "You think you can handle that?" Daniel hesitated for only a second, but it was enough to make his heart pound. This was it, the point of no return. He nodded. "Yeah, I can handle it." Morales gave another nod, satisfied with Daniel's response. "Good. You messed this up, though, and it's not just your problem. Understand?" And the threat was clear, and Daniel felt the weight of it settle over him like a suffocating blanket. He knew what was at stake, and he had no choice but to see it through. Over the next few hours, the plan was laid out in detail. Daniel was to take charge of moving the drugs from the warehouse to a series of drop-off points across the city. He would be accompanied by two of Morales' men, who would be watching him closely. One misstep, one sign of betrayal, and they would deal with him swiftly and without mercy. As the meeting wrapped up, Carter pulled Daniel aside, his voice low. "This is your shot, Stone. Don't screw it up." Daniel could only nod, his mind racing. The operation was already in motion, and now he was in the thick of it. There was no way out, no way to backtrack. He was in too deep. The night passed in a blur of tension and activity. Daniel followed Carter's instructions to the letter, overseeing the transport of the drugs as planned. Every moment felt like walking a tightrope, the fear of being discovered gnawing at him constantly, but he kept his composure, playing the role of the loyal recruit, doing everything he could to earn Morales' trust. By the time the operation was complete, it was nearly dawn. The city was quiet, the streets deserted as Daniel made his way back to his car. His body was exhausted, his mind spinning with everything that had happened. But as he sat behind the wheel, the adrenaline finally started to wear off, leaving only a deep, bone-weary fatigue. He had survived the night, but he knew it wasn't over. Morales trusted him for now, but trust in that world was fragile, and it could be broken at any moment. One wrong move, and it would all come crashing down. As Daniel drove back to his house, his mind drifted to Sarah. She had no idea what he had just been through, the danger he had faced. She was still asleep, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface of their lives. Daniel had tried to keep her out of this mess, but he knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. When he arrived home, the house was quiet, the early morning light filtering through the curtains. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, the weight of the night pressing down on him. He was exhausted, mentally and physically drained, but there was no escape from what he had gotten himself into. As he collapsed onto the couch, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Carter. "Good job tonight. Morales trusts you. Keep it up and we'll take him down soon." Daniel stared at the message for a long moment, a hollow feeling settling in his chest. He had done what he needed to do, but the victory felt empty. He wasn't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot. The days that followed were a blur of tension and fear. Every time he saw Morales or his men, Daniel felt the crushing weight of the lie he was living. The undercover operation was taking its toll, and each day brought new risks, new dangers. He was always on edge, always waiting for the moment when everything would come crashing down. The pressure was suffocating, and Daniel began to question whether he could keep going. The guilt, the fear, it was consuming him. He had started this to save his career, to protect the life he had built, but now he wasn't sure if it was worth it. The cost was too high. Then one evening, as Daniel was getting ready to leave the station, he received another message. This one wasn't from Carter. It was from the same unknown number that had sent him the message about the docks. "You're not as good at lying as you think, Stone. Watch your back." The words sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Whoever had taken the photograph, whoever had been watching him, they were still out there. And now, they were letting him know that they weren't done with him yet. Daniel's world, already fragile, began to crumble even faster. The walls were closing in, and he had no idea how much longer he could hold everything together. He had gotten this far, but the price of survival was growing too high. And deep down, Daniel knew that sooner or later, the lie he was living would catch up to him.